"Ma'am, we do not serve people like you here." The words landed so hard that even the soft music playing through the ceiling speakers seemed to disappear. A little girl standing near the waiting area looked up from her coloring book and frowned. "Mom," she whispered, tugging on her mother's sleeve. "Why will they not help her?" No one answered. The lobby of the upscale customer service center fell into an uneasy silence. Sunlight streamed through 20-foot glass windows, reflecting off polished marble floors and chrome fixtures. The place smelled faintly of fresh coffee and expensive leather. Everything about it projected success. Everything except the moment unfolding near the front desk. Danielle Carter stood calmly beside a reception counter, a slim folder tucked beneath her arm. She wore a simple navy cardigan, dark slacks, and comfortable walking shoes. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or status. She looked like an ordinary customer hoping to receive assistance. Across from her stood Bradley Collins, the facility manager. His pressed suit, silver name badge, and confident posture made it clear who was in charge. At least that was what he believed. "I already explained the situation," Bradley said loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "Our services are intended for qualified clients." Danielle remained composed. "And how did you determine I am not qualified?" Bradley smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "Experience." Several customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. A man holding a coffee cup lowered it slowly. An elderly woman waiting near the lounge shifted in her chair. Everyone could feel something was wrong. Nobody seemed willing to say it aloud. Danielle simply nodded. "I see." Her calm response appeared to frustrate Bradley more than an argument would have. He expected anger. He expected embarrassment. Instead, she looked at him with quiet curiosity, as though she were observing something important. Nearby, Isaiah Brooks watched from behind a service desk. At 48 years old, he had spent nearly 2 decades working in facilities like this one. He recognized unfairness when he saw it. His hands tightened around a clipboard. For a moment, it looked like he wanted to step forward. Then he glanced toward Bradley and hesitated. Around the room, employees suddenly became very interested in their screens, paperwork, and phones. The silence felt practiced, familiar, like something they had seen before. Danielle noticed that too. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in every detail. The nervous receptionist avoiding eye contact. The customer who had been waiting nearly 30 minutes without assistance. The employee who looked afraid to speak. She quietly opened the folder beneath her arm and slid a pen across one page. Bradley frowned. "What are you writing?" Danielle closed the folder. "Just making notes." A brief laugh escaped him. "About what?" Danielle looked around the lobby one more time. The frightened employees. The uncomfortable customers. The child still wondering why no one would help her. Then she met Bradley's eyes. About everything. For the first time that morning, the manager's confident smile faded ever so slightly. Bradley's expression recovered almost immediately, but Danielle noticed the brief flicker of uncertainty before it disappeared. Around the lobby, customers slowly returned to their conversations, yet the atmosphere remained tense. The question hanging in the air was no longer whether Danielle would receive service. The question was why she had been denied it in the first place. Danielle quietly stepped away from the counter and moved toward a row of leather chairs overlooking the main customer area. She sat down, crossed one leg over the other, and placed her folder on her lap. Sunlight poured through the massive windows behind her, casting long reflections across the polished floor. From where she sat, she could see nearly everything. The reception desk, the service counters, the waiting lounge, the employees, the customers. Most importantly, she could see how people were treated when they thought nobody important was watching. Within minutes, another customer entered the facility. He wore work boots covered in dust and carried a lunch cooler in one hand. He approached the front desk with a polite smile. The receptionist glanced toward Bradley before answering his questions. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. The customer left looking disappointed. Danielle made another note. 10 minutes later, a well-dressed businessman arrived carrying a luxury briefcase. Before his second foot crossed the entrance, 2 employees hurried forward to greet him. Complimentary coffee was offered. A private consultation room was prepared. Danielle watched the contrast carefully. Nearby, Isaiah continued working behind the service desk. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the lobby. He seemed concerned, not only about Danielle but about the entire situation. Years of experience had taught him when something important was unfolding. Across the room, Bradley laughed with several employees near the front counter. The confidence had returned to his voice. Whatever concerned Danielle's notebook had caused appeared to be fading. He assumed she was simply another customer who would eventually leave. Then an elderly woman approached the desk carrying a stack of paperwork. Her hands trembled slightly as she searched through the documents. Bradley barely looked at her before directing her to another department. The woman appeared confused. She stood there for several moments, uncertain where to go next. Before anyone else moved, Isaiah stepped away from his workstation and approached her. He gently reviewed the paperwork and pointed her toward the correct office. Relief immediately softened her face. She thanked him twice before walking away. The exchange lasted less than a minute. It also revealed something Danielle had begun noticing throughout the morning. Whenever kindness appeared inside the building, it almost always came from the same people. She wrote another note. As the hours passed, patterns continued emerging. Certain customers received patience. Others received indifference. Certain employees spoke freely. Others carefully measured every word. The building looked successful from the outside, but beneath the polished surfaces Danielle sensed a culture shaped by fear and favoritism. Then she noticed something else. A young employee near the reception area accidentally made eye contact with her. For a brief second, the employee seemed tempted to say something. Anything. Instead, she quickly looked away. Danielle followed the young woman's gaze. It landed directly on Bradley Collins. And in that moment, Danielle realized the problem inside this facility ran much deeper than a single unpleasant interaction. The afternoon crowd continued to flow through the building, but Danielle no longer saw individual customers. She saw patterns. The longer she remained in the lobby, the clearer those patterns became. Some people were welcomed before they even reached the counter. Others seemed invisible the moment they walked through the doors. The difference had nothing to do with the services they requested. It had everything to do with how they were perceived. Danielle sat quietly with her folder resting on her lap, watching the facility operate like a machine following unwritten rules. Near the reception desk, the young employee who had briefly looked at her earlier continued working with visible caution. Every few minutes, she glanced toward Bradley's office. The behavior reminded Danielle of employees she had encountered before in struggling organizations. People who wanted to do the right thing, but had learned that speaking up came with consequences. A few feet away, two customers waited for assistance. One eventually checked his watch and left. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody even acknowledged that he was gone. Danielle wrote another note. Across the room, Isaiah helped an older gentleman understand a stack of paperwork. The customer smiled and shook his hand before leaving. Once again, a simple act of kindness came from someone who was not even responsible for customer intake. Danielle noticed Bradley watching the interaction from a distance. His expression hardened slightly. Moments later, he called Isaiah aside. Their conversation remained private, but Isaiah's posture changed immediately. His shoulders lowered. His smile disappeared. When he returned to his workstation, he looked disappointed rather than surprised. Whatever had been said, it was not the first time. Danielle made another note. The facility manager was not simply influencing customer experiences. He was influencing employee behavior as well. The realization settled heavily in her mind. Then something unexpected happened. The young employee from the reception area approached her chair carrying a bottle of water. Her hands trembled slightly. "I thought you might want this," she said quietly. Danielle accepted it with a warm smile. "Thank you." The employee hesitated. For a second, it seemed she wanted to say more. Then her eyes shifted toward Bradley's office. "Have a nice afternoon," she said quickly before walking away. Danielle watched her return to her desk. Fear. That was the word she kept coming back to. Not respect. Not professionalism. Fear. The building looked polished and successful, but fear seemed woven into nearly every interaction. Outside the tall windows, clouds began drifting across the afternoon sky. Sunlight faded and softened. Reflections stretched across the marble floor. The atmosphere felt strangely calm despite everything Danielle had witnessed. She opened her folder and reviewed the notes she had collected throughout the day. Each page pointed toward the same conclusion. The problem was not one rude comment. It was a culture that allowed those comments to exist. As she closed the folder, Bradley emerged from his office and scanned the lobby. His eyes eventually settled on Danielle once again. This time he did not look annoyed. He looked concerned, and for the first time since entering the building, Danielle sensed that someone was beginning to realize she was not there by accident. Bradley remained near the center of the lobby for several moments, pretending to review paperwork while repeatedly glancing toward Danielle's chair. The confidence that usually surrounded him seemed less natural now. He had spent years reading customers within seconds. Their clothes, their posture, their tone of voice. Those quick judgments had become a habit. Yet the woman sitting quietly by the window refused to fit any category he understood. Most customers who felt disrespected either argued or left. Danielle had done neither. She simply stayed. She observed. She wrote notes. And somehow that unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. Across the lobby, activity continued as usual. A young father entered carrying a sleeping toddler on his shoulder. An elderly couple reviewed documents near the reception desk. Employees moved between offices carrying folders and tablets. From a distance, the building looked busy and productive. Danielle noticed something else. The young receptionist who had offered her water was called into Bradley's office. The manager closed the door behind them. Through the glass wall, Danielle could see the conversation but could not hear it. The receptionist stood quietly while Bradley spoke. Occasionally she nodded. Twice she glanced toward the lobby. Each time her eyes briefly found Danielle. After several minutes, the young employee left the office looking visibly discouraged. Her shoulders were tense. Her smile had disappeared. Danielle watched her return to work without saying a word. Another note joined the growing list inside her folder. A little later, Isaiah approached Danielle's seating area carrying a stack of customer forms. He paused for a moment. "Are you still waiting for assistance?" he asked politely. Danielle smiled. "Technically, yes." Isaiah nodded slowly. "I am sorry about that." The sincerity in his voice stood out immediately. "You do not need to apologize for something you did not do," Danielle replied. Isaiah glanced around carefully before speaking again. "Sometimes people here forget what customer service is supposed to mean." Danielle studied him for a moment. There was no bitterness in his voice, only disappointment. "And what is it supposed to mean?" she asked. Isaiah looked toward the entrance where a customer was struggling to carry several folders. Without hesitation, he walked over and opened the door for him. Only after returning did he answer, "Treating people with dignity before anything else." Danielle smiled. "That is a good answer." Before he could respond, Bradley's voice echoed across the lobby. "Isaiah." The single word carried enough authority to stop the conversation immediately. Isaiah straightened. "I should get back to work." He walked away without another sentence. Danielle watched him go. Fear again. The same pattern. The same pressure. The same culture. Outside, gray clouds had begun gathering over the city. The sunlight that once filled the windows softened into muted silver. Reflections shifted across the marble floor. The atmosphere felt heavier now. Near the reception desk, the little girl from earlier tugged on her mother's sleeve once more. Her voice carried farther than she realized. "Mom, why does that lady still not have help?" Several customers turned. A few employees froze. Even Bradley looked up. The question lingered in the air unanswered. Danielle slowly closed her folder and looked around the room. For the first time all afternoon, people were no longer pretending not to notice what was happening. And that changed everything. The little girl's question seemed to linger in the lobby long after she stopped speaking. Conversations grew quieter. Customers who had previously looked away now openly watched the front desk. The polished building suddenly felt smaller, as though everyone inside had become aware of the same uncomfortable truth at exactly the same moment. Danielle remained seated, calm and composed, while Bradley stood near the reception area struggling to regain control of the atmosphere. For years he had relied on confidence to end difficult situations. This time confidence was not enough. Too many people had witnessed what happened. Too many people had started asking questions. Bradley straightened his tie and walked directly toward Danielle. The sound of his dress shoes echoed across the marble floor. Several employees froze. Isaiah noticed immediately and looked up from his workstation. Danielle slowly lifted her eyes as Bradley stopped in front of her chair. "Ma'am," he said, forcing a professional smile, "I think it would be best if you continued your business elsewhere." The words landed heavily. A customer near the coffee station lowered his cup. The elderly woman Isaiah had helped earlier stared openly at the manager. Even the receptionist looked shocked. Danielle tilted her head slightly. "Are you asking me to leave?" Bradley folded his hands in front of him. I believe this facility may not be the right fit for your needs. Danielle glanced around the lobby. Interesting. Bradley's smile tightened. I am trying to avoid unnecessary disruption. For a moment, nobody spoke. Outside, rain clouds continued gathering above the city skyline. The bright afternoon sunlight had faded into a cooler gray light that reflected across the windows. Danielle stood slowly and picked up her folder. Customers followed her movement with their eyes. Bradley appeared relieved. He believed the situation was finally ending. Then Danielle asked a simple question. How many customers have you decided were not the right fit before ever learning who they were? Bradley's expression hardened immediately. I do not think that is an appropriate question. Danielle nodded. I thought it was. A few customers exchanged glances. Someone quietly shook their head. The atmosphere had completely shifted. People were no longer watching Danielle. They were watching Bradley. Across the room, Isaiah took a small step forward before stopping himself. He understood that something important was happening, though he could not yet see the full picture. Bradley looked around and realized the attention was no longer working in his favor. This conversation is over, he said firmly. Danielle closed her folder. You are right. For a brief second, relief crossed his face. Then she added, it is almost over. The words were calm, polite, yet something about them made Bradley visibly uneasy. Danielle turned toward the entrance and began walking away. Customers moved aside to let her pass. The little girl watched her leave with curious eyes. Near the door, Danielle paused and looked back one final time. She took in the nervous employees, the uncomfortable customers, and the manager standing alone in the center of the lobby. Then she quietly wrote one final note inside her folder before stepping through the glass doors. What Bradley did not know was that the most important meeting of his career had already been scheduled for the following morning. Rain began falling shortly after Danielle left the facility. Thin streams of water traced paths down the massive glass windows while employees inside finished the final hours of their workday. The building felt quieter than usual. Conversations were shorter. Smiles appeared forced. Something had changed after Danielle's visit, even if nobody fully understood what it was. Isaiah noticed it immediately. Customers seemed distracted. Employees whispered more often. Even Bradley appeared unsettled. Throughout the afternoon, he repeatedly checked his phone and reviewed reports that normally would not have required a second glance. Confidence still surrounded him, but it no longer looked effortless. It looked rehearsed. By early evening, the lobby had nearly emptied. Cleaning crews moved through the hallways. The reception desk lights glowed softly against the darkening sky outside. Isaiah gathered paperwork from the service counter and prepared to leave for the night when the young receptionist approached him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Did you see the woman who was here all day? Isaiah nodded. I did. The receptionist hesitated. There was something different about her. Isaiah smiled faintly. I was thinking the same thing. She looked toward Bradley's office before speaking again. I almost told her everything. Isaiah's expression became serious. Why didn't you? The young woman glanced down. Because I need this job. The answer carried more weight than either of them wanted to admit. Isaiah understood immediately. He had seen talented employees become silent simply because they were afraid of losing stability. Fear had a way of spreading quietly through an organization. It rarely announced itself. It simply settled into people's lives until speaking honestly felt dangerous. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. The receptionist gathered her things and headed home. Isaiah remained for a few more minutes organizing documents before finally turning off his workstation. As he passed Bradley's office, he noticed the manager sitting alone behind the glass walls. The desk lamp illuminated stacks of reports scattered across the surface. Bradley stared at his computer screen but did not appear to be working. He looked distracted, troubled. For a moment, Isaiah considered stopping to say goodnight. Instead, he kept walking. Across town, Danielle sat in a quiet hotel room overlooking the rain-soaked city. A small desk lamp illuminated the folder she had carried throughout the day. Page after page of notes covered the table. Names, times, observations, patterns. The evidence formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. Danielle carefully reviewed every detail. The frightened employees, the overlooked customers, the repeated decisions that favored appearance over fairness. Most revealing of all were the reactions she observed whenever authority entered the room. Culture always reflected leadership. The phrase echoed in her mind as she turned another page. Finally, her phone lit up with a new message. The subject line was short. Executive review meeting confirmed. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Mandatory attendance. Danielle read it once and placed the phone beside the folder. Outside the window, rain continued tapping against the glass. The city lights shimmered through the darkness. For several moments, she simply sat in silence. Tomorrow would not be about anger. It would not be about embarrassment. It would be about truth. And somewhere across the city, inside a building that still looked successful from the outside, people were preparing for another ordinary day. None of them realized that by this time tomorrow, everything would be different. The conference room overlooking the facility was already full by 7:55 the next morning. Managers sat around a long, polished table reviewing reports and exchanging quiet conversations. Coffee cups rested beside laptops. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, employees moved through the lobby below, completely unaware that the most important meeting in the building's history was about to begin. Bradley arrived carrying a tablet and a confident smile. Although the previous day had left him uneasy, he had convinced himself that the situation was behind him. Numbers were strong. Performance reports looked good. As far as he knew, this was simply another executive review. At exactly 8 o'clock, the large screen at the front of the room flickered to life. Faces from corporate headquarters appeared one by one. Regional directors, human resources leaders, compliance officers. The unusually large attendance immediately caught everyone's attention. Conversations faded. Chairs shifted. Bradley straightened his posture and offered a professional greeting. "Good morning, everyone." Several executives nodded politely. None smiled. The atmosphere felt strangely formal. Then the conference room door opened. At first, nobody paid attention. Most assumed it was an assistant delivering additional documents. The footsteps continued across the room. One manager stopped speaking. Another lowered his coffee cup. Gradually, every eye turned toward the entrance. Bradley looked up. The color drained from his face almost instantly. Danielle Carter walked into the room, carrying the same folder she had held throughout the previous day. Gone was the casual cardigan. Gone were the simple clothes that had encouraged so many assumptions. She now wore a tailored business suit and carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who belonged there. The room became completely silent. Danielle walked to the front of the table and placed her folder beside the presentation screen. Nobody spoke. Several managers exchanged confused looks. Others simply stared. Bradley seemed unable to look away. Danielle calmly surveyed the room before addressing everyone. "Thank you for being here." Her voice was steady, professional, familiar to several executives appearing on the screen. The realization began spreading through the room, one person at a time. Danielle pressed a button on a remote control. A title slide appeared behind her displaying the name of a corporate oversight division. Beneath it was her name. Beneath her name was her position. The silence deepened. One manager inhaled sharply. Another lowered his eyes toward the table. Bradley's expression collapsed entirely. Every assumption he had made the previous day suddenly stood exposed. Danielle opened her folder. "Yesterday, I spent the entire day inside this facility observing customer experiences, employee interactions, leadership practices, and operational culture." She paused. "What I witnessed requires immediate attention." No one interrupted. No one challenged her. The evidence was already sitting inside the folder she carried. The notes, the observations, the patterns. Danielle looked directly at Bradley. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, simply with clarity. "The problem was never what people knew," she said quietly. "The problem was what people thought they could get away with." Around the table, reality finally settled in. The customer they had ignored was never just a customer, and the consequences they never expected had already arrived. For several moments after Danielle finished speaking, the conference room remained completely silent. Nobody reached for a coffee cup. Nobody checked a phone. Even the executives appearing on the large screen seemed content to let the silence do its work. Bradley sat motionless. The confidence that had once defined him was gone. In its place sat the unmistakable weight of realization. Danielle opened the folder and began placing documents across the conference table. Customer feedback reports, employee statements, internal reviews, operational summaries. None of them were dramatic by themselves. Together, they revealed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. A pattern of customers being judged before receiving assistance. A pattern of employees feeling pressured to remain silent. A pattern of leadership decisions driven by assumptions rather than fairness. Danielle clicked a remote control and a series of slides appeared on the screen behind her. Dates, notes, observations, anonymous employee feedback collected over many months. Every page reinforced the same conclusion. The issue was never a single interaction. The issue was a culture that had slowly drifted away from the values it claimed to represent. Around the table, managers lowered their eyes. Several appeared genuinely disappointed. Others looked shocked. One executive from headquarters finally spoke. These concerns were brought forward more than once. His voice was calm but firm. Why were they not addressed? Nobody answered immediately. The question hung in the room unanswered. Danielle already knew why. Fear had become normal. Accountability had become optional. The people responsible had assumed nobody would ever look closely enough to notice. Danielle turned another page. I also want to recognize individuals who demonstrated professionalism despite difficult circumstances. The atmosphere shifted slightly. Names appeared on the screen. Employees who consistently helped customers. Employees who received exceptional feedback. Employees who chose integrity even when it was inconvenient. Then one name appeared larger than the others. Isaiah Brooks. Several people looked toward the back of the room, where Isaiah sat quietly after being invited to attend the meeting. Surprise crossed his face. Danielle smiled warmly. Multiple customers specifically mentioned your willingness to help when others would not. Isaiah seemed unsure how to respond. He simply nodded. Danielle continued. Character matters. Leadership begins there. The statement carried through the room. For the first time that morning, people were not thinking about consequences. They were thinking about standards. The human resources director distributed several documents across the table. Regional leadership reviewed final recommendations. Compliance officers confirmed findings. Every step followed established policy. Every decision had been carefully documented. There was no anger in the room. No celebration. Only accountability. Danielle closed her folder and looked around one final time. Organizations do not improve because problems disappear, she said. They improve because people choose to confront them honestly. Several managers nodded slowly. Even those facing difficult consequences seemed to understand the truth in her words. Through the conference room windows, morning sunlight now filled the lobby below. Customers continued arriving. Employees continued working. Life inside the facility moved forward. Yet everyone seated at that table understood something important. By the time this meeting ended, the future of the organization would look very different from its past. 3 months later, the building looked almost exactly the same from the outside. The glass entrance still reflected the morning sun. The reception desk still stood beneath the company logo. Customers still arrived carrying folders, questions, and expectations. Yet anyone who spent more than 5 minutes inside could feel the difference. The atmosphere no longer felt tense. Employees no longer glanced nervously toward management before answering simple questions. Conversations sounded natural, genuine, human. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a familiar young mother walked through the front doors holding her daughter's hand. The little girl who had once asked why someone was not being helped immediately recognized the lobby. This time she smiled. Before they even reached the reception desk, an employee greeted them warmly and offered assistance. The little girl looked around and whispered something to her mother. Both laughed softly. Nearby, Isaiah Brooks moved through the facility carrying a tablet and greeting employees by name. His title had changed, but his character had not. Customers frequently stopped him with questions. Employees sought his advice. He listened to everyone with the same patience that had defined him long before anyone noticed. Across the lobby, the young receptionist who once feared speaking honestly now led customer experience initiatives. Her confidence had returned. People listened when she offered ideas. More importantly, she no longer looked afraid. Through the large windows, sunlight spread across the polished floor in long golden reflections. The building felt brighter than Danielle remembered, not because the lighting had changed, because the culture had. Around noon, a black sedan quietly entered the parking lot. Danielle stepped out alone. No announcement had been made. No meeting had been scheduled. She simply wanted to see the results for herself. As she entered the building, employees greeted her naturally. Customers continued their conversations. Nobody panicked. Nobody froze. Respect had replaced fear. Danielle walked slowly through the lobby. observing the same details she had studied months earlier. An elderly customer received patient assistance. A young family was guided through paperwork without being rushed. Employees treated people like individuals rather than interruptions. The differences were subtle. Together, they meant everything. Near the waiting area, Danielle paused beside the same row of chairs where she had once sat alone with a folder on her lap. For a moment, she remembered the silence, the tension, and the uncomfortable questions nobody wanted to answer. Those memories felt distant now. Isaiah noticed her standing there and walked over. Neither spoke immediately. They simply watched customers moving through the building. "Looks different," Isaiah finally said. Danielle smiled. "It does." He nodded toward the lobby. "People notice when they are treated with dignity." The words settled comfortably between them. Danielle looked around one final time. There were no speeches, no celebrations, no banners announcing change. Real change rarely arrived that way. Instead, it appeared quietly in everyday moments. A greeting, a smile, a customer who felt welcome, an employee who felt heard. Outside, a gentle breeze moved across the parking lot as afternoon sunlight reflected against the glass. Danielle turned toward the exit and walked away. Behind her, the facility continued operating exactly as it should have all along. And in the peaceful rhythm of ordinary people treating one another with respect, the strongest form of justice finally revealed itself.